So I guess I'm a booktuber now, and let's be real, I have no idea what I'm doing. So I watch a lot of YouTube, and I've noticed that there is not a lot of sci-fi in the booktube community, so I decided to take it upon myself to add a little bit more to that. I've been working behind the camera for over 10 years. This is my first time ever sitting on this side of the camera, and let me tell you, it's very intimidating, so we need a little bit of this to help, and therefore we are books and beers. So I thought for this first video, I should talk about some of the underrated books in the science fiction genre, in my opinion. So for this list, I went to Goodreads and I looked at how many ratings each of these books had, and I've sorted the list in order from most ratings all the way up to number 1, which is going to be the least ratings and therefore the most underrated book. And normally I would probably rank these and like how much I like them, but I've rated all of these 5 stars, I believe. So I thought it would be best to go by its underratedness, if you will. Just for comparison, some big name books like Harry Potter, for example, has 6.5 million ratings. Leviathan Wakes, which is the first book of The Expanse, has 150,000. Ender's Game has 1,072,000. And The Martian has 755,000 ratings. So those are some like more of the more popular books. So let's see how these compare to those. Alright, so at number 5, I have Fortune's Pawn by Rachel Bach. So this is the first book in the Paradox trilogy, and it follows Debbie Morris, who is a hot-headed, heavily drinking, promiscuous mercenary. So she is basically just trying to further her career as a mercenary and get a lot of experience in a short amount of time so that she can further her career goals, I guess. She has like this dream job, but she needs a lot of experience. So she signs up as a security officer or security job on the ship called the Glorious Fool. And anyone in this universe who knows what this ship is knows that this ship is known for getting into a lot of sticky situations and always being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And because of that, 1 year of experience on this ship, if you can survive it, is equivalent to something like 5 years of experience on any other ship. This book is listed as a science fiction romance, and I can kind of see that. I mean, the romance is pretty heavy. Like, she instantly falls in love with one of her shipmates. The love interest's name is Rupert. And yeah, the romance is pretty heavy, but it's also a very, very strong sci-fi story, which is why I was drawn to it. So much that I even gave all 3 books in the series 5 stars. And I've got to say that Debbie Morris is by far probably the best female protagonist I've read. There might be a couple others that are up there, but she's definitely probably the best. So Fortune's Pawn, number 5. I just realized I forgot to say how many ratings this has. I'm off to a great start already, aren't I? So this one has 11,998 ratings. So coming in at number 4, we have Inherit the Stars by James P. Hogan. Now this one has 3,769 ratings, and this one is probably one of the hardest sci-fi books I've ever read. Hard sci-fi meaning it is very technical in its writing style. It doesn't have much character development. It's more focused on the realism of the science and the technology behind it. And actually, my original review that I wrote for this book, I mentioned that it is probably the best hard science fiction book I've ever read. So basically, the premise of this book is that humans have colonized the moon, and amidst their exploration of the moon, they come across a human skeleton which is inside of a spacesuit. And none of the crew are missing, so they don't know who this person is. And they end up doing some carbon dating on it and realizing that this skeleton is 50,000 years old, which is older than the known age of humanity. So this sparks a lot of debate on where humans came from, and perhaps humans weren't originally from Earth and they are a much older species. So this book is the first book in the Giants trilogy. I think it's a trilogy. I think they made more afterwards. But I've only read this first one. I've heard that the other ones are not as good. It's on the list. Eventually I'll get to them, but this first book right here, definitely a 5-star read. Highly recommend it. By the way, tonight I am drinking Blue Moon Light Sky. It's their new light version of Blue Moon, which is one of my favorite wheat beers to begin with. Pretty good. All right, number 3 is Jack Glass by Adam Roberts. And this one has 2,128 ratings on Goodreads. Now this one I originally picked up solely because of this cover. Like, that's a pretty cover. I knew nothing about it. I bought it used from the science fiction section of a used bookstore, and it sat on my shelf for a while. And then I finally read it, and I'm like, wow, this book is amazing. Definitely easy 5 stars for me. It's tagged as a, like, crime novel in space, and it definitely reads like your typical crime mystery novel, with obviously a strong sci-fi setting. So what really actually hooked me on this was on the back of the book here, the tagline says, "Jack Glass is the murderer." That at least is quite transparent. So from the get-go, we know that the murderer is Jack Glass. So that's not the mystery that we're trying to solve. What we do learn is why he's a murderer and what he has done. And actually, by the end of this story, you start to wonder if he is the bad guy. So the story itself is broken into 3 segments, almost like 3 separate self-contained stories, each with their own like twist ending and their own plot. But towards the end, everything starts to come together and you start to see this chronological progression between the stories, which really ties everything together and makes for a crazy ending. And I'm not going to spoil anything, obviously, but definitely not something that I saw coming. And some of the tactics he uses and some of his ingenuity is definitely pretty grotesque and gruesome and amazing. And definitely recommend checking this one out. This is Jack Glass. Almost time for another beer. All right, so number 2 is Saturn by Ben Bova. And this book has 1,239 ratings. Now, this is book number 13 in his Grand Tour series, and these are all books that don't need to be read in any particular order. They have very minor connections between them. Sometimes you might have a character crossover from one to another, and you don't really need to read them in order other than books that are direct sequels or trilogies to each other. For example, Saturn does have a direct sequel called Titan, but it again can be read as a standalone. So in Saturn, basically the Earth is in political and environmental turmoil, and all of the nations of the world decide to entice, I guess that's the word, entice all of the derogatory, irredeemable, incorrigible citizens to partake in this one-way trip to Saturn. So we end up with a massive, massive ship full of convicts, felons, and just generally shady people, all of which have their own personal motive for going on this journey. But what really makes this book interesting is the dynamics between all of them and how they're trying to leverage the situation for their own personal gain. And you also will learn what the ship's true purpose is partway through the novel, and that's where everything starts to get really interesting. This is the first time I came across a book where the ship is actually kilometers long and kilometers in diameter, and therefore has artificial gravity, so as it's spinning, you're standing on the hull, and it feels like you're on Earth, on gravity, and there's grass, and there's parks, and things like that. But you can look across to the opposite side of the ship, and you'll see houses and stuff like that, basically on the roof, which is its own gravity, so you're seeing it upside down. And this is the first book I ever saw that did that, and I know there's plenty others that have done that same thing, and this obviously isn't the first that has done it, but this is the first book that I discovered that, and I thought it was pretty interesting. Also, Ben Bova's books are usually hit or miss. He has some great ones, he has some that are skippable, not really worth reading. For the most part, his books don't really get the best ratings, but personally, I actually really loved this one. I don't know what it was about it, but I thought this was a great book, and definitely check it out. So that is Saturn by Ben Bova. All gone. All right, and number 1, we have Retrograde by Peter Caudron. Now, this one only has 1,132 ratings at the time of recording this video, so this is a very underrated book in my opinion, and it definitely deserves the number 1 spot, and hopefully this will get more people to read it. This book has been out for 4 years now. It came out in 2016, and almost nobody, it seems, knows what it's about. It's also the first book in the Mars Endeavor series. I actually didn't even know that there was a second book in the series until I was doing a little bit of research for this video. Apparently the second book just came out, so I'm going to have to pick that up and read it. So this book follows the Mars Endeavor colony, which is a multinational colony created on Mars, and is comprised of scientists, astronauts, medical personnel, etc. And they live in this underground colony where it's separated, and their living quarters are basically separated by nation. So you have the US section, you have the Russians, and you have the Chinese, etc. A lot of books have done this in the past where they'll have the fledgling colony on another planet and they're trying to survive. But what this one does interesting is it explores what would happen if there wasn't a disaster on their planet where they're living, but what if there's a disaster back home on Earth? So we learn that there's been this massive nuclear war on Earth, and all of the nations of Earth have started throwing nukes at each other, and the planet is basically in chaos. Because of that, the colony is no longer in direct contact with their home bases back on Earth. The information they're getting about this war is only coming in bits and pieces, so they don't know the full story. And because of this, they don't know who started that war, who nuked who, or what exactly is going on. And because of that, it's sowing distrust between all the different nations and causing their own turmoil up on the planet. So basically, they're trying to figure out what exactly happened on Earth, and they have to learn to re-trust each other and not focus on these jumbled bits and pieces of information they're getting back from Earth, but to actually try and survive together on Mars as one colony instead of separating themselves back out into individual nations. To me, this is a massive sleeper hit, and this deserves a lot more recognition than what it gets. I've only ever seen one copy of it in the wild, and that was at a used bookstore. There was just one copy on the shelf. But definitely check out Retrograde. Great book. So that's it. That is 5 of my most underrated science fiction books. Let me know if there's any that you think are underrated, and I'll check them out, and maybe they'll make it to another underrated list. I'd love to read some more of your suggestions, because I always love finding these obscure books that not really many people know about, and things like that. So until next time, I'm Kyle, and I need another beer.